Great. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to this discussion and Q&A on historical perspectives on the war in Ukraine. I'm Robert Fletcher, Professor of History here at the University of Missouri, and I'm joined today by a number of colleagues from the History Department who will try and pin at the top of this video wall. Brad Nichols, specialist on the history of war in Europe, including on the German-Russian borderlands in the 20th century. Linda Reeder, a specialist in the history of modern Italian history, contemporary Europe, migration and gender. Ilyana Karthus, who dials in live from her class, maybe the whole class can give us a wave, say hello, who works in the fields of modern history of France, European intellectual and cultural history. And Russell Zguta, Professor Emeritus here at Mizzou, and an expert in the early modern Slavic and Russian culture. I'm a historian of imperialism in the modern period, particularly Western imperialism in the Middle East and East Asia. Now, all of us work on different aspects of the history of Europe, where the eyes of the world have been turning in the last few days. And those of us teaching at the moment too have all had quite thought-provoking and quite moving discussions with our students in recent days too. We wanted to organize this session for our students to ask questions and to share responses and reactions. And I'm going to be opening the floor to all of you for that purpose very shortly. And throughout the session, if you'd like to ask a question, please do send me a message in the chat or use the raise hand function, and I'll keep a list and we'll endeavor to get to as many questions as we can. Before we get to that open Q&A, I've asked each of our panelists to offer a few thoughts on how, as historians, they are viewing, interpreting, trying to understand Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And each of my colleagues will talk for a few minutes in turn. But before we get started, I wanted to open with a few thoughts on the role of history in a crisis like this. One challenge for historians, perhaps the most obvious one, will I think be rewriting the history of the 1990s and 2000s in Europe in light of what's unfolded in recent days. Was some kind of opportunity missed in the wake of 1989 to come up with some kind of new security architecture or arrangement for Europe in which the Russians felt they had a bigger stake, the stake that offered the Russia of Gorbachev and Yeltsin a place for peaceful cooperation. Now, in our divided politics of the moment, the rights and wrongs of the expansion of NATO has quickly and unfortunately become a highly partisan issue. Yet there ought to be a way for historians to explore what has happened dispassionately. And I think we're going to need that historical perspective more than ever. The second broader point is that amid such fast-moving events, it's hard to see beyond what's just happened in the last few hours. But trying to discern broader forces, to work out the significance of what's changing and what's not, this is part of the historian's role. And doing so can help us to cut through the noise of the news cycle. It can also correct mistakes in our interpretation that are forming in real time. Like many colleagues, it's been really frustrating to hear news outlets repeating the idea that Russia's invasion somehow shatters a peace in Europe that is held unbroken since 1945. You can only make that claim if you forget, or you choose to forget, about the Yugoslav wars throughout the 1990s, for example. Now, I point this out not to detract from the significance of what we're seeing now, but rather to remind us of how fragile peace in Europe is. And as a historian of imperialism too, we must remember just how much of the European past has played out under imperial projects of expansion and rule. Empire was not merely something that Europeans did to the rest of the world. Empire formed part of the lived experience of Europeans themselves for centuries. A person living in the Western Ukrainian city of Lviv at the start of the 21st century might have been born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, might have been educated in Poland, been a young adult in the Third Reich, grown old in the Soviet Union, and retired in an independent Ukraine, all without ever leaving the city. Empires have long fought here then, and the romanticization of those empires, the appeal of trying to recover some of that lost imperial glory, does not merely help explain some of Putin's apparent motivation. Very similar aspirations, a neo-Ottomanism, a desire for a more interventionist and expansionist presence in the former domains of the Ottoman Empire. This has also marked the foreign policy of Recep Tayyip Erdogan's modern Turkey. Indeed, British, French, Ottoman, and Russian empires fought for influence over Crimea and the Black Sea in the 1850s. And the question of which of these powers would influence the region formed part of the so-called Eastern question that came to dominate great power politics of the 19th and 20th centuries. And taking up that longer historical perspective helps us to see more clearly the real significance of the most recent examples of Russian expansion. For that expansion southward and westward across the Black Sea, not just the annexation of Crimea in 2014, not just the war in Georgia in 2008, but also beyond Europe into Syria in the context of the Syrian civil war, this was not about defeating Islamic extremism, as Putin claimed then. It was not about denazification, as he claims now, but it was about re-establishing Russia as a world power and imperial power. It's a policy that worked for him thus far. And in that respect, Putin's many successes represent the absolute defeat of at least 250 years of British policy towards the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea, which was all about trying to frustrate Russian imperial advances. Now, I know that all this is much that my other colleagues are going to be talking about and developing further. So the very final point I'll make before I hand over to Brad is that exploring these events with an eye to the broader historical dimension, I think fights against a tendency, a mistake, I think, to interpret these events primarily in terms of our own contemporary national political concerns here in the United States, to read them primarily through our own issues, lenses, and obsessions. There are other questions, other perspectives that matter, and pursuing them through history helps bring these important other perspectives, correctives, to the fore. And on that note, I'll hand over now to Dr. Brad Nichols, Assistant Professor in the History Department with expertise in the history of modern Europe, modern Germany, war, and society. Brad.
Thanks, Rob. Naturally enough, my feelings on what's happening are also largely informed by my knowledge of the region's history. Like most people, of course, I was stunned and appalled to hear of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I honestly never thought we'd see a ground war fought in Europe again between two sovereign states, let alone one on this scale. Once my initial shock wore off, though, the first thing that came to mind is that, as Rob touched on, Putin's actions are consistent with a longer trend in Russian history. One in which authoritarian leaders have repeatedly sought to shore up domestic political support and stave off calls for reform at home by expanding outward into the near abroad. This was true of the conquest of the czars in the 19th century. This is to some extent true of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 as well. There's another relevant pattern here too, though, that isn't unique to Putin or Russia, because it comes straight out of a playbook followed by any number of modern dictators in Europe and elsewhere. And that's the claim that military intervention in a neighboring country's territory is justified because that territory is inhabited by people who belong to the same nationality as the aggressor. This is the catalyst of World War II in Europe. The Nazis asserted that ethnic Germans in borderland regions, places like Czechoslovakia and Poland, the Nazis asserted that these ethnic Germans were in grave danger, that they had to be protected. The same kind of thing goes a long way toward explaining the horrendous outburst of genocidal warfare and ethnic cleansing that ripped apart Yugoslavia during the first half of the 1990s. These are ominous precedents, to say the least. But what I think surprises me most for what's going on right now in Ukraine is that the Russians seem to have bought into the same kind of pretext so thoroughly that they truly believed the Ukrainians were going to welcome them as liberators, or at the very least that the Ukrainians were going to roll over. And they really should have known better. The Ukrainians fought for independence during and after World War I and World War II, unsuccessfully, but they fought for independence nonetheless. And in between, in the early 1930s, some 3 to 4 million Ukrainians perished in a terror famine deliberately orchestrated by the communist regime of Joseph Stalin, deliberately orchestrated from Moscow. This is known as the Holodomor. So clearly the Ukrainians have no great love for Russian rule, right? Like there's a reason why they chose independence when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And this is why I'm really of two minds when it comes to the struggle Ukrainians are waging as we speak. On the one hand, I'm incredibly inspired by their bravery, their solidarity. And I do think, just from an operational perspective, I do think they can win given the right circumstances. I definitely would not suggest, as some have, that they lay down their arms and surrender. On the other hand, I'm extremely worried about the human cost of armed resistance over the long term if the present hostilities turn into an occupation. Even if the Russians manage to capture the cities, it's not going to end there because the Ukrainians have a long tradition of guerrilla warfare that they will almost certainly draw on to continue the fight from the forests. And this is precisely what concerns me the most right now, because such a war would likely degenerate into an utterly remorseless conflict with massive loss of life on both sides. So that's where I'm at right now, and I'll leave it at that for now, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brad. Next, I'd like to turn to Professor Linda Reeder, who's a historian of modern Italy, modern European history, also a historian of migration in the European continent. And of course, we must remember something like 600,000 Ukrainians have already been displaced by this, according to yesterday's UN figures anyway. So this is a huge part of the story. So Linda, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, I'm going to lay out and try to keep my comments 5 minutes or so. There's sort of 3 areas in which I've been thinking and reading through what is happening in Ukraine and the war on Ukraine that I'd like to talk about. One is from the Italian perspective, from a little bit outside, but within a country that was deeply marked by the Cold War. And you know, after World War II, the Italian Communist Party was the largest opposition party on the continent, a Communist Party. And the Soviet Union had played a really important role in Italian politics. It was, under the Cold War, a source of destabilization. It kept the right, it kept the neo-fascists in power up until 1989. And very quickly, and I'm being very schematic here, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, what we see in Italy is that shift of Russia from destabilizing Italian politics as alliance with the left, as a destabilization with the alliance of an emerging xenophobic, right-wing, nationalist, federalist, separatist parties. And I think this war, I think Ukraine has really put that into stark relief for me, because it has transformed in about a week the ways in which Italians are talking about the EU, the role of EU, of Euroscepticism. And you see immediately that kind of weight of this history of Italy's relationship between the United States and Russia playing out in the ways in which their understanding and seeing this war. And I just want to point out that the fear of nuclear war is part of this thinking and equation. I read recently in La Repubblica that there is a shortage of bomb shelters that have been ordered, and there is a run on them in Italy. There is serious fears and discussions of Chernobyl and the sort of environmental costs of when it happened and what potentially could happen now. And there are real questions and thinkings about the meaning of NATO. And should they be so closely and not allied with the United States? So these are sort of some of the questions and framings I'm thinking about. Migration, really quickly, this does seem to be turning into the biggest movement east to west since World War II. Yes, there are hundreds of thousands of migrants who came over from Syria, but we are talking 600,000. We are talking tens of thousands in days. 1945, 1947, just to put some very rough numbers on this, roughly 6-7 million displaced persons were relocated in those 2 years. A huge majority, as Brad said, were ethnic Germans being pushed out of the East. Yugoslavia, over 500,000 ethnic Germans were displaced. 2 million Poles were displaced. Allies moved over 2 million Soviet identified citizens. It's unclear if they were all citizens back into Soviet territories. At the peak, over 14,000 people a day were crossing this east-west border. And it's what we are seeing again. Now, again, as Robert said, and I think this is really important, is how is this movement reshaping our understanding? And as migrationists, we have these nice little categories of, there was the post-war migration, then there was the labor and Gastarbeiter, the worker migration, south to north, the Southern Europeans, the Turks coming in. Then there was the refugee after 1989, initially Eastern European, we can talk about that. I wouldn't call them refugees. And then the more recent, after the really 2008 and onward, various forms of refugee, economic, environmental, war refugee migration. This has raised really intense concerns and heightened and poured fuel on xenophobia and the rise of the right. We've been seeing this, how this new migration is going to reshape and reframe who constitutes a good migrant, who is not, is to me a really interesting question. My very last point, and then I will turn this over, is the question of historical memory. In the few conversations I've had with various colleagues from Norway to Italy to the Netherlands, one of when I'm asked a very open-ended question of what are you thinking, what are you feeling, the proximity in historical memory and geographic proximity seem to merge. So my conversation with my colleague Per-Olof, he immediately went to his mother's story of being born in 1940 and in 1941 in Finland, and in the midst of the Winter War was sent off to live with distant relatives where she resided her entire life. It turned out, with that kind of breakup of families, that kind of forced internal migration, mobility, it is going back to that post-war moment in memory that I find very interesting. And I think there is something there really hard to think about in terms of the power of the violence of that post-war period. I went back and started, as soon as I heard the war open, one of the things I did, the first things I did was pick up Sebald's work on the natural, what is it called? The Natural History of Destruction. And he brings up the ways in which historians have not really reckoned with the level of violence and destruction, personal, emotional, physical, of the post-war period. And I feel like what is happening in Ukraine is crystallizing that. So those are the things I'm thinking about. I will pass this on to Ilyana, and then Ilyana to...
Yes, Ilyana, over to you. Yep.
We're in a classroom. Can you guys hear me okay?
It's a bit of
That's a lot of
echo.
feedback.
Yeah,
we
a
got a
lot
lot
of
of feedback.
Yeah,
Oh.
maybe.
You may have to,
Sound better?
nope.
No, I think whilst you're trying to sort that out, maybe we should move on to
Let's go to Russ.
To Russ. So Russ Scooter, Emeritus Professor here at Missouri, over to you, and then we'll try and get back to Ilyana later.
Thank you. I'd like to start with a quote from today's New York Times, front page, and then with a couple of personal notes before I say something more substantive. Today's New York Times has a headline, quote, an exodus of 660,000 echoes of 20th century Europe at war. Quote, the war in Ukraine has set off the fastest mass migrations in Europe in at least 3 decades, prompting comparisons with the Balkan Wars of the 1990s and providing echoes of the vast population displacement that followed World War II, end quote. And here's the personal note. On Saturday, Andrew Higgins, reporting from the Polish border, writes an article with regard to the influx of people fleeing from Ukraine into Poland, quote, about a woman that he was interviewing, quote, cradling her 3-year-old son who was gravely ill with cancer, the 25-year-old Ukrainian mother staggered into Poland on Monday. And then, end quote, and then she says, the reporter says that her husband stayed behind to fight. And reading that, I had a deja vu moment, or as Yogi Berra, the great catcher for the New York Yankees, would say, deja vu all over again. In June of 1944, as World War II was ending, the Germans were in retreat. My family, my dad and I, we were living outside of Lviv. And when my dad learned that KU had fallen and that Lviv was next, we picked up a suitcase and my mother picked me up and we headed for the Polish border. And so in June of 1944, I experienced what this mother with her 3-year-old son, I was 2.5 at the time. That's why I was being carried by my mother across the border. The reason that my parents left was because they had the experience of Soviet occupation between 1939 and 1941 after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. And because my father was associated with the church, he was a choir master, choir director in the Byzantine Rite Ukrainian Catholic Church. And because my mother's side of the family, her brother was studying medicine in Vienna, and she hails from a family that had produced one of the early 20th century nationalist leaders in Ukraine, Andriy Melnik. We were marked people. And so because of that, we had to flee. And in June of 1944, that's what happened. The other personal note that I'd like to relate is on Sunday, last Sunday, I received an email from one of my former students who had graduated from the university in 2005. And he emailed me and made some comments indirectly about Mr. Putin's attempt to amalgamate Ukrainian and Russian history, which he did in the famous screed that he published this past summer, entitled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." It's 19 pages. I read it, annotated it heavily. I would probably give it a C- with a note, come see me for a rewrite. In any event, the former student notes in his email that he has come to understand why, in teaching my Foundations of Russian History class since 1967 at the university here, when he took the course, that I was insistent when I talked about Kiev and Rush of not calling the ruler of Kiev, Kyiv, not Kiev. Why promote the colonial Russian mantra of using names that were transliterated from Russian, that I would call the princess in the 10th century who ruled as a regent, Olha, rather than Olga, that I would call Volodymyr the Great, who was the ruler in the late 10th, early 11th century, Volodymyr rather than Vladimir. And he says, I understand that now after what's happened in Ukraine in recent days. What I'd like to do next is just very briefly, perhaps, go through the events that have led up to this crisis between Russia and Ukraine. What brought us to this point? I label these as remote and immediate. The remote causes, I think, began with the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989, when Mr. Putin was a KGB agent in East Berlin. This apparently was his first assignment. He was just a young, aspiring KGB operative. Apparently, from what I have read and examined about him, this had a profound impact on him as he was getting messages from Moscow and leaving East Berlin. Obviously, as all of you, I'm sure, realize, soon on the heels of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the swift dissolution of the Soviet Union and the emergence of 15 sovereign independent states. Russia has maintained that very early in the 1990s, apparently a verbal commitment, I think it was a verbal commitment because I have not been able to locate a document, was made by the US and NATO, pledging that NATO would not expand into states which were part of the former Soviet Union. And again, I've had a hard time locating such a document if it exists, but this is what I've read in places. Now, in spite of that, in 1992, there were overtures made to NATO. Ukraine joined the North Atlantic Cooperation Council. President Kravchuk visited NATO headquarters in Brussels, and Ukraine established an embassy in Brussels. This is 1992. In 2008, Ukraine and Georgia were offered invitations potentially to join NATO if they carried out certain governance and transparency reforms. And it was not long after this that in 2008 again, President Yushchenko began the process known as the MAP, Membership Application Process for NATO. This was in 2008. 2 years later, the election of Viktor Yanukovych, with his Moscow leanings, put the whole project of NATO application, put the whole project of NATO map on hold. And of course, not too long after that, the Maidan revolution, the revolution of dignity, takes place in 2014. And the beginning of the end, more or less, also begins for the Ukrainian state. Now, these were the remote factors as far as, very briefly. In my view, there are two immediate factors, one of which I don't think I've seen talked about very much. They both happened early in 2019. In January of 2019, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church received a document called a Tomos from the Patriarch of Constantinople, taking the Ukrainian Orthodox Church away from the Patriarch of Moscow and placing it in Kiev under the Patriarch of Kiev. Up to this time, there were three Orthodox churches in Ukraine. There was the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church, which had gone into exile after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1922, and always amused me because they moved to Bound Brook, New Jersey. Then, after the revolution in 1991, the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church returned, so that was one. There was the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, and then after 1991, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kiev Patriarchate. So in the interest of uniting these churches, there was a good deal of effort on the part of the Ukrainians to have the Orthodox Church decoupled from Moscow. As you know, Putin was not shy about using the church, and the church has been very supportive of the regime. And so in January of 2019, the Patriarch of Constantinople undid something that was done 300 years earlier in the second half of the 17th century, when the Orthodox Church, Kievan Patriarch, was subordinated to the Patriarch of Moscow. So I think that was another nail, so to speak, in Ukraine's coffin, if you will. A month later, in February of 2019, the Verkhovna Rada, the Parliament of Ukraine, in several meetings, passed a resolution amending the Ukrainian constitution that had been adopted in 1996. And the amendment that was written into the constitution in February of 2019 stipulated that henceforth Ukraine's, quote, strategic objective, end quote, would be to join the EU and NATO. So in February of 2019, the Ukrainian constitution was amended with this particular amendment to promote the ultimate association with the EU and with NATO. Those were then, again, in my estimation, both the remote and I'm probably collapsing a lot of things that happened in the interest of time. What might be the ultimate outcome of the crisis for Ukraine? Again, some of what I'm going to say has been suggested by others. I know that, Brad, you mentioned this occupation, which seems to be the least likely possibility. I think the Soviets learned from when they occupied Western Ukraine, Halychina, after World War II, that there was a partisan / guerrilla movement that lasted 10 years. And at one point, it had grown to a total of about 100, it's been estimated 150,000 partisans were active until ultimately the Soviets were able to put this movement out of existence by the mid-1950s. So occupation, I think, is the least likely possibility for Mr. Putin. It would be expensive and administratively practically impossible unless he were to place in every city, in every village, every town, people from Moscow to rule over 44 million people. A second possibility would be a puppet government. After all, when Yanukovych was forced to flee in 2014 to Russia, he's only 71, so I think that he might, in the eyes of Mr. Putin, have a future back in Ukraine. I think that, again, is not a very likely possibility. He was run out of town, so to speak, in 2014. I think it's improbable that he could provide any kind of even puppet leadership. The third possibility, which is perhaps the most likely, unless the Ukrainians can beat the Russians in military fashion, is what some people have described as Finlandization. As probably most of you know, after Finland fought this 3-month war in 1939, 1940, when Russia asked Finland to hand over some territory in order to protect Leningrad. The Finns refused, and the war was on. When the war was concluded, after the peace treaty was signed, Finland more or less had accepted the notion that it would not conduct any foreign policy that would be at variance with Moscow. And the term, as you know, has gotten a pejorative connotation. And the Finns recently apparently have been talking about the possibility of NATO, in my understanding. At least this is what I've been reading in some fashion. Switzerland, as all of you know, during World War II, proclaimed neutrality, and during the Nazi period, and was spared in the center of Europe. So Finalization, or some form of Finalization, might be a possibility, of the three that I mentioned. Anyway, this is my take on what's going on now. The only other thing that I wanted to add when I was talking about personal things, yeah, when we left Ukraine, ended up in the occupation zone, the American occupation zone of Germany, and in a DP, displaced persons camp, for 4 years in Berchtesgaden. In 1948, Mr. Truman persuaded Congress to pass the Displaced Persons Act. And it is because of that we were able to emigrate to this country. And as I've been telling my students for many years, since 1967, I'm here teaching at the University of Missouri. This is payback to Mr. Truman and Missourians, the homegrown boy who made it possible for me and my parents to emigrate to this country. That's it.
That's great, Russ. Thank you so much for those personal and historical reflections on the situation. Ilyana, shall we try again? See if we can make it work. If we can't, we'll throw it open to wider questions, but let's give it one last try.
No.
I'm still getting a little feedback.
Ilyana, we'll come close and try it one more time.
We've been having trouble. Yeah, is that better?
Yep.
A little better. I don't want to take up too much time because I want to make sure there's time for questions. But my colleagues have covered a lot of what I was going to say. For me, it's seeing old historical patterns that are converging with this invasion of the Ukraine, the struggle between democracies and autocracies, right? Seeing that again, it makes me think of the interwar period, right? Where we saw all these trends happening. Ambitions of territorial expansion in Europe, like when Hitler claims the Sudetenland based on language, the rhetoric of a one people, that there's a Russian world and everybody who's Russian speaking should be part of that world. Think about if Spain suddenly said, all countries speaking Spain would now be part of my kingdom. It's ridiculous. But nevertheless, an old historical trend. A sense of historical grievances we're seeing again. bringing something back that was lost. Sympathies and admirers of strong leaders like Putin. That's not new. Mussolini's on the cover of Time magazine, how many times? 9 times during the interwar period. Businesses failing to see how they have built a tyrant's war chest, right? We saw that with both Mussolini, economic support, and Hitler as well. And so, I mean, lots of these things are coming from classes I'm teaching on state sovereignty, democracies, fragility of democracy, etc. The last thing I'm seeing is, again, the softening of enemies as well, right? And looking at France, France has always kind of, in a way, prided itself on its relationship with Russia, that it's had a long history of relationship with Russia. Not too long ago, Macron was sitting with Putin promising he wasn't going to invade the eastern part of Ukraine. And I think Macron believed it. So it's very interesting to see the French and Russian and their failure to kind of assert themselves in the past on many occasions with Russia. And then, lastly, it's very personal for me, being the generation in 1989, 1990, I was around 18, 19 years old. The Berlin Wall fell, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania claimed independence. It was such a time of promise. And I never thought I'd see this kind of reverse sort of thing happen in terms of, coming from that generation. It's been very hard. Anyway, let's open up to questions, but I wanted to give kind of the big picture of historical trends, and that a lot of this stuff is quite, is repeating itself, right? It's not quite surprising.
Great, thank you so much. So I think there's a lot of questions, some questions have already started to come through. Again, if you'd like to ask, please do send one of us a message, put it in the chat, use the raise hand function, and we can start to come to you. The first question, what I've seen that I think we should turn to, because I think it's an interesting one, is the one that William Falk asks, which is it correct to generalize that what has happened is supported by more than Putin and a few advisors? I mean, this struck me as an interesting question, of course, because there's that debate as a historian now about, the official mind of imperialism. Is imperialism something that actually has a kind of body of practice behind it when a state undertakes an imperial expansionist adventure or misadventure? Or is it just the whim of the individual? I think it's a really good question. I do not have an answer, but it's part of what I was trying to get at with that first question I planted from the beginning about us. We need to revisit the history of the 1990s and 2000s. Was there a missed opportunity to actually build a broader security apparatus that had Russian involvement that could have worked and satisfied all parties? But if there wasn't a missed opportunity, I wonder if that's because we're actually putting a lot of explanatory power on Putin himself as the individual that's decided to gamble anyway, irrespective of what was put in place. So I suspect more work will need to be done. I wonder if one of my colleagues wants to take that thought further. Russ.
Recently, I was looking at a poll, a respectable poll that had been done before the invasion in Russia. And this surprised me. I might say it shocked me, because among Russian people, the 144 million Russians, the poll found that only 8% supported a war against Ukraine, and 9% supported arming the Donbass area where the separatists had been. So that, I guess, perhaps addresses part of the question with regard to the situation in Russia itself.
Great, thank you. I can see a question waiting from Michael Sanders, I think, top left.
Yes, it's Michelle.
Michelle.
I appreciate all of the information about the Ukraine, of course, but I have 2 friends who are currently in Russia, and they're talking about like panic buying at their grocery stores as well, and the economic sanctions already hitting them as they are very lower class. I actually met them while they were here at Mizzou on a scholarship that they had won. And I was wondering, like, historically speaking, what can like the civilians of Russia expect from this war? And is there any way I can get more Russian-based news? Because right now, the majority of what I'm seeing is for the Ukraine, and of course, my heart goes out to them. But you know, most of the civilians in Russia did not want this to happen, from what I've been hearing from my friends.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just take just a couple comments here. As Professor Cooper Drury noted the other night at the event at the Kinzer Institute, in discussing sanctions, which is his area of expertise, the impact that these usually have is disproportionately felt among the average citizen, the average consumer, although there are ways, and we've seen this in the last week, to structure sanctions to go after elites, to sanction them personally. We've seen this with Putin's oligarchs. But I don't have an answer in terms of what the average Russian can expect. Economic conditions and living conditions are going to continue to deteriorate, I imagine, until this gets sorted out one way or the other. Unfortunately, that's going to be the case. The squeeze that's being put on Russia right now, it's going to trickle down to, again, the average person, unfortunately.
Thank you, Michelle.
Can I just
Sorry,
chime
Linda,
in here? I think that is really important and it is a concern, but I also think we can't lose sight of what is happening in Ukraine and the relative and sort of disproportionate pain and weight of low food on your shelves and the cities and the bombs. I don't know. I mean, my understanding also, and I understand and took hard Cooper, Dean Drury's position on sanctions, but sanctions are a weapon. They are a tool. So those are just some thoughts. I think historically, yeah, war hurts, but Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you for the responses. I've just been concerned because it seems like the media, there isn't much coming out of Russia at this moment, and that is very concerning to me.
Well, I think censorship, and I think our Russian colleagues, or Russian scholars and Soviet scholars can talk about the pressures and the kinds of censorship that I don't know. I read what you read on this.
Yeah, and I too don't really know where you can get accurate information coming out of Russia right now. I would just say, obviously, do not listen to RT.
Well, just to put a period and cross the T's, I think Mr. Putin has total control of the media, all aspects of the media, print and otherwise, and he has had control over the media. So I think it would be very difficult. Notice that Kharkiv, the city which the Russians claim that they have taken, the one in the northeast, the second largest city in Ukraine. One of the things that was demolished today was the information center, the building that housed the information. So it tells you something about the importance of getting information out. That I know I'm not finishing my sentence here. Maybe I'm entitled to being emeritus. I don't get graded on this. And then I lost my train of thought. All right, that's all I'm going to say right now for that.
Thank you. There's another question that came up from Brian Norris pretty early on, which I just want to take us back to. He says, democracies don't fight democracies. Russia is not a democracy. Is this the root of the problem? What are the prospects for democracy in Russia? I wondered if our panelists had any thoughts on that point.
Democracies do fight democracies. This is not unheard of. But you're absolutely right that this is part of the problem. I mean, if the 8% poll number is legit about how many Russians support this, obviously you would not have this invasion if Putin were not in control of the government.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's as you said, it's more complex than that. One wonders whether the prospects for democracy now are any better than they were a few weeks ago. I'm not convinced, but I think this is one of the first times that you can really see the Putin regime under intense strain in a way that it hasn't perhaps been for some time. As I said, generally my reading of expansionism to date has worked in his favor, and just essentially he's won. I mean, he won the Syrian regime for Assad. That was an absolute victory for the Russian state. This may work very differently. Okay, questions coming in thick and fast. I will take, let's take another one. So Monique has written, does anyone know for certain the objective of Putin is to expand USSR for resources only or to test NATO? War is generally for profit. So what is his underlying profit other than physical resources, since it's also sacrificing his civilians? I suppose a lot of us are trying to get in the minds of what is the broader Russian objective here, or indeed is it a Russian objective, or is it just the objective of the leader? It goes back to that earlier question, I suppose, about how we try and distinguish between these things. I wonder if panelists have comments on that challenge for us as historians.
In terms of the objective, I don't know that it's so much about resources. I think this is part of a broader geopolitical, geostrategic vision that Putin has had since he was, barricaded in the basement of the Soviet embassy as the Berlin Wall was coming down, or at least that has developed since then. The idea or the argument that's been put forward by Putin and repeated, unfortunately, by a lot of commentators in the West, that this is NATO's fault. If NATO hadn't encroached or been trying to accept Ukraine as a member, which it hasn't been, that this wouldn't have happened. Well, the reason Putin doesn't want NATO in Eastern Europe and the former Eastern Bloc is because he wants Russian influence there. NATO is a defensive alliance. So this idea that NATO is encroaching and encircling Russia, I just don't have any patience for that. I think this is all about a geopolitical vision of Russian greatness, of Russian imperial grandeur, that it's coming from a man who famously or infamously said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. So I really don't think it goes that much. I mean, obviously it's more complicated, but I think that's the heart of the matter here. I would also point to something I touched on in my introductory remarks, which is I think domestic politics are driving this a lot too. I don't have any sort of firm evidence of that because we don't have a lot of information coming out of Russia, but it seems to me that he had some kind of internal polling data that suggested he was increasingly unpopular, and that this is at least in part a reaction for that. So I don't know that it's about profit or resources, and if it were there, the Putin regime is certainly losing on that front right now. Their bottom lines are being hit very hard. The oligarchs I'm speaking of.
Thank you. Yeah, it's another question here from our colleague John Freimeyer, who points out the sort of German story here about how quickly Germany has shifted position towards considering some form of remilitarization, or at least a radically new form of thinking about the armed forces. So this is kind of a question, I guess, for Linda, for Brad, for Ileana, actually for everybody, about what is actually changing in politics and priorities in the European states that you all kind of study. I have a few thoughts about this in terms of Britain, but I'm really interested to hear what you're reading of how things are changing in extremely rapid timescales within the national political context that you're most familiar with. I guess, Linda, you touched on this a bit in your opening remarks, but maybe I could start by asking you to say a bit more.
Yes, I think it's sort of in the immediate that, and I know historians are not good in thinking in the immediate, so this is not playing to my strengths. But what I am seeing is a reframing of Euroscepticism, as I was saying before, that I'm finding really striking in how I'm understanding Italy and Italians' understanding of themselves as members of the EU and in this post-war world. So I do think it is the memory of the war, and particularly Italy coming out of a very brutal civil war in the wake of 1943 and German occupation and invasion and the partisans, and the civil war that has never been fully dealt with until recently. And it's only beginning, people are talking about in the last 15, 20 years, that there's a lot, this is bringing that back up almost to the core again. And as I was saying, both in historical memory too, it is kind of collapsing back into that immediate post-war period with a little bit of the gloss of nuclear fear running through it. What I find very interesting is there is more discussion I'm hearing here in the States about the idea of a new Cold War. There is not much discussion I'm hearing in Italy that this is somehow a return to Cold War. And I think it's a very clear recognition there is no rebuilding of superpowers or stasis or stability that was woven into the Cold War.
I mean, I'd love to hear from Ileana as well about how it's playing in French dynamics. Brad, too, your thoughts. I mean, mine briefly on Britain is that I suppose ever since the collective self-imposed national trauma of Brexit from a few years ago, Britain has been rethinking its orientations and where it sits vis-a-vis Europe, where it sits vis-a-vis the world. There was already quite a substantial rolling series of national military funding and spending reviews going on in Britain, as it tries to see what type of military power it will need to be for this 21st century, now that it's got this separate relationship with the European Union. I can imagine, and in fact, very quickly, MPs are on their feet saying that everything we've been drafting over the past 4 or 5 years, we need to tear up and think about completely again. So there's been calls for a new comprehensive military spending review and to think again about what exactly is the nature of our European commitment. Have we, for example, just blown the entire budget on aircraft carriers designed for use in the Pacific, which actually are not going to be quite as useful to us as we thought? So it is certainly changing broader strategic thinking about what Britain's part in military defense of Europe should look like. Ileana, do you have thoughts about the French context? You may have IT problems. I can see you.
I'm having.
Yep.
Not really, to be honest. You know, a lot of my students are very curious about America. You know, we've theoretically in years before us thought of, you know, the world looked to us as a beacon of democracy, you know, and we've kind of fallen short, you know, of that. And I think students are very concerned what we do as Americans, you know, what is the position of America and what is the position of Cooper, you asked that question in the comments. What do we do? How involved do we get?
Yeah, would someone like to take up Cooper's question, which was owned 449 at the Kinder event on Monday? Jay Sexton raised the point that now's the time for America to become more heavily involved in this crisis. Do the panelists agree with that statement? What should the American response be? I feel a natural American should probably ask this question first before
I'll jump in here. I think I completely agree with what Dr. Sexton was saying. We are part of the global power. We are implicated this. We are complicit in it, in its creation and its resolution. It matters to us. It impacts us in every way. it is much more than what we see at the gas pump, because that is what I'm hearing from my students, is the kind of immediate concern. But it is, you know, if we think about 2 years of living in a kind of isolated bubble, the way in which this is coming after COVID and after this kind of frozen border, again, thinking like a migrationist, of it fills me with fear if we do not step up and be a part of this.
Brad, do you have comments on this as well?
Not really to add in terms of what the American response should be in terms of speaking to what's going on in Germany and how their response. This is John's question. I'm a little concerned that the Germans are flexing their muscles a little bit right now. I don't want to take this too far. There's this famous anecdote about NATO generals, or French NATO generals, as soon as the Berlin Wall came down, and they said, well, shit, it's been about 50 years, but now we have to deal with the Germans again. Worried that there was going to be, another resurgent Germany. That was obviously overblown, but I think it is indicative of the fact that I don't know if it's so much due to the success of the demilitarization of Germany or denazification, which was not actually all that successful, at least not in the short term. I don't know that it's so much we're seeing that fading away as much as we're seeing Germany stepping up to the plate here, I think, to take European leadership. It already has economic leadership of Europe. Like there's mainland Europe. There's no question about this. So I think this is in response, though, to domestic forces as well. You have 100,000 Berliners out on the street in solidarity with Ukraine. The new chancellor has to respond to that. So I'll just leave it at that.
Great. Russell, maybe you have thoughts about what America should or should not be doing in this context.
Well, I think all of you probably heard our president yesterday in the State of the Union message. I think he's been sort of gradually putting the squeeze on Russia and Mr. Putin. He keeps saying that short of any boots on the ground, and I know that Zelensky keeps pleading for some kind of assistance that would be more capable of dealing with what he has to deal with regard to the military side of things. I think economic sanctions are fine, but I think probably an increased level of other support, defensive weapons, and maybe something that will work against some of the weapons that the Russians are using against the Ukrainians right now. That's what I was hearing the president saying yesterday, that perhaps what Zelensky is asking for maybe is a little beyond the economic and maybe more in the military sense that America could produce and provide for the Ukrainians. That's my take on it right now. So sanctions are fine, but I think they are one prong of the response, and I guess maybe a military response, not with troops, obviously, but with equipment and ammunition would be another prong of this response.
Thank you. I think probably one last question that I can see from the chat, and then we'll do a final call if anybody wants to add in another. But Lily Myers asks, do you believe this might be the start of a larger takedown of places around Russia to restore it to the largest world power? I.e., are there other parts of the periphery of the what we should perhaps start overtly calling Russian imperial state that look like likely places where Vladimir Putin might consider to expand if it turns out this Ukraine misadventure goes his way. Hard counterfactual type question. But I mean, there are, of course, around the periphery of the Russian state, all number of contested borderland regions. I don't know of that many others where this particular strategy would work, however, this idea of the sort of ethnic minority Russian group calling for incorporation type rhetoric. There are some parts where that would work, as Brad knows well, but there are others where it doesn't work. And also it's about the ability to destabilize neighboring states as well. But anyway, perhaps panelists have thoughts on that question. Brad, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm just reading the wording of the question here.
Yeah, sure.
I have other questions coming in. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, this is absolutely part of a larger geopolitical and strategic plan, agenda. And I said earlier, I gave the famous quote about what Putin said about the collapse of the Soviet Union and had a question about that. Putin doesn't want to bring back the Soviet Union as like a communist multi-ethnic state. He wants to bring back the old Russian Empire. I mean, when you read his televised statements from last week, like I seriously felt like I was reading Tsarist propaganda from the late 19th century. It's striking how outmoded it sounds to me. But to Lily's question, yes, I think that's absolutely what's going on here. But I just don't know how far you can get with that for the same reasons. People, even back with the seizure of Crimea, people at the time were making references to Munich and appeasement before World War II, the giving of the way of the Sudetenland to Germany, Czechoslovakia. And there are a lot of times where those kinds of allusions are stupid, frankly, or at least ill-informed and inappropriate. But I would say now that, in hindsight, that appears pretty accurate in terms of what was allowed to happen back then. And certainly it provided the current invasion force with a third leg, which typically makes it a lot easier to seize territory. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians right now, the Russians have severe logistical problems with their military and they're not able to pull this off. But I think, yes, to answer your question, to put a bow on it, that's absolutely what's going on here. I don't know the extent of that plan. I've been hearing people talk about, is Kazakhstan next? I don't know. As Linda mentioned, historians are notoriously bad at predicting the future, living in the present. But my sense is that that's what's going on here.
Rob?
Okay. Oh, sorry, Russ.
Yeah, let me follow up maybe or on the question you said, what can the U.S. do? I think it's incumbent on scholars. I think Ukraine has not really been able to assert itself as a discipline. The Slavic Review published an article by Mark von Hagen. I don't know if the name means anything to you. Mark von Hagen, for many years, taught at Columbia, and then he finished his career. He died a few years ago at Arizona State. But in 1993, 2 years after Ukrainian independence, he published an article titled, in Slavic Review, probably the preeminent journal in the field in the world, Does Ukraine Have a History? And it served as the jumping off point for discussion. There were scholars from Germany, scholars from the UK, and the US responding to him, and he wasn't tossing this out. It was obviously a controversial title, but I think he made the point that Ukraine and Ukrainian studies have not entered the canon. We can talk about women's history being a very respectable field, Black history, Jewish history, and Ukrainian studies. At the time that he wrote the article, there were two places where you could pursue a PhD in Ukrainian studies effectively: at the University of Alberta, the Canadian Ukrainian Research Institute, and at Harvard, the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. One was established in 1971, the other one was established in 1973. And even in what was available when I began teaching, I was using Nick Razanovsky's History of Russia. And the Kievan period in that book is labeled as Kievan Russia. Now, these days, if you went to a professional meeting and you stood at a podium and you were talking about Kievan Russia, you'd be laughed off the podium. So we've come a long way. What was available when I started teaching was George Vernadsky's 6-volume History of Russia. Volume 1, Ancient Russia. Volume 2, Kievan Russia. Volume 3, The Mongols in Russia. That was the best available multi-volume history of Russia. And Vernadsky, who taught for many years at Yale, trained a lot of PhDs, and they have been teaching. And Ukrainian studies, there was no Ukrainian studies. I think since 1991, Ukraine has reclaimed some of its history. If nothing else, it's no longer Kievan Russia. But Mr. Putin is going back. If you look at that document that I alluded to that he published 19 pages of this summer, the history that he invokes in there is sometimes quite eye-raising. And so that's why I said I would give him a C-, tell him to come for a rewrite. But anyway, so I think it's incumbent upon those of you. I'm through 50 years worth of teaching Russian and Ukrainian history. I think I need a break. But for the generation that's going to be teaching our students, I think it's important that the Ukraine reclaim, as I said, it's begun to reclaim its history. Mr. Putin has set it back somewhat. But I think the invasion, actually, if there is anything that's going to be positive from it, is perhaps not only in this country, but a world recognition that this is a nation of 44 million people, the breadbasket of Europe, the apple of discord. You know, Napoleon passed through. World War I was fought mostly there. World War II. We've had our share of problems where I'm from, where I was born, not far from Lviv. Anyway, that's my sermon for the day.
I actually think that's a really interesting and thoughtful kind of place to kind of put our thoughts to an end, actually, Russ. That's a lovely way to think about the importance of history in understanding what's happened, but also who gets to tell those stories, what types of stories, what types of questions are we asking, and the role of historians in our public discourse. There are still other questions pending, but I think we've more or less run over time. Apologies for that. I'd like to thank everyone who's asked a question, everyone who's come along today and attended. Thank my fellow panelists for their thoughts. Thank you all very much. And as I think was listed earlier on in the chat by Nicole Monnier, there's other events coming up as well to follow as we kind of keep our eyes on what's happening in Ukraine. As you go to all of them, I'd encourage you to just keep that historical perspective alive. There's something, I think, important that we can add